9:42 in the morning, a retirement community in Central Florida. The kind of place where the lawns are clipped to the same height on every lot, where golf carts hum past at a pace that says, nobody here is in a hurry anymore. A woman steps out of a beige villa carrying a small canvas tote bag. She's headed to the post office. Maybe the grocery store after that. An ordinary Monday, the day before Thanksgiving. She doesn't make it past her own driveway. Two unmarked cars are parked at the end of the street. They've been there since before sunrise. As she reaches the sidewalk, a deputy steps out, hands visible, voice level. He says her name, the name on her driver's license, the name her neighbors know her by, the name she's used for longer than most marriages last. She stops walking. And for 1 second, just one, her face does something it hasn't done in over 40 years. It remembers a different name, a real one. The deputy tells her she's under arrest, out of Kentucky, a charge that's been sitting open since before some of her neighbors were born. She doesn't run. She doesn't argue. According to officers on scene that morning, she stood there in shock as it sank in. And when one of them spoke to her, his words were almost gentle. "Well, we're here for you, ma'am. Definitely here for you." Somewhere a few hundred miles north, in a quiet house in Louisville, Kentucky, a 75-year-old man is about to get a phone call that will undo 42 years of silence in a single sentence. And 300 miles in the other direction, in a small apartment near Ocala, Florida, a 46-year-old veterinary technician is about to be told that her entire childhood, every memory, every story her mother ever told her about why they moved so much, was built around a hole she never knew was there. This is the story of a little girl in a sailor dress, a photograph that outlived a decade, a father who never once let himself stop believing, and a phone call that finally, after 42 years, didn't go unanswered. Stick with me on this one, because the way this case finally breaks isn't a dramatic forensic miracle. It's something much smaller. A half-remembered sentence, a stranger's second glance at a familiar face. And that's exactly what makes it worth understanding in full. We're going to start at the beginning, April 1983, because to understand how someone disappears for 42 years in plain sight, you have to understand exactly how ordinary the morning she vanished really was. Before we go back to 1983, if stories like this are the reason you're still here at 11 minutes when most people have clicked away, do me a favor and hit subscribe right now. Not for me, for her. Cases like Michelle's only get solved because people keep paying attention long after the news cycle moves on. Every subscriber tells YouTube to put cases like this in front of more eyes, and more eyes is genuinely how cold cases get cracked. So if you're in, hit that button now, because I promise you, by the end of this video, you're going to want to know what happens to the people left behind. Okay? 1983. Let's go back. Picture a photograph. It's grainy, slightly overexposed, the way most home photos from 1983 are. A 3-year-old girl in a crisp white sailor dress. Dark hair pulled into 2 short pigtails. A wide gap-toothed smile. Missing one front tooth the way every kid that age seems to be missing something. Her name was Michelle. Everyone who loved her called her Shelley. She was born on October 5th, 1979, in Louisville, Kentucky, to Joseph and Debra Newton. Joe was the kind of dad who carried his daughter on his shoulders during neighborhood walks. Debra was the kind of mother who packed a diaper bag like she was planning for a small war. They weren't rich. They weren't famous. They were a young blue-collar family in a blue-collar Kentucky neighborhood, living the most unremarkable version of the American dream you could imagine. And in the spring of 1983, that ordinary life was about to get a little bigger. And Debra told Joe she'd found something promising in Georgia. A new job opportunity, a chance at a fresh start somewhere warmer, somewhere cheaper to live. Joe was on board. The plan was simple, the kind of plan thousands of American families made that decade. Debra and Michelle would go down first, get the new place set up, get the lay of the land. Joe would wrap up loose ends in Louisville, give notice at work, handle the house, and follow a few weeks later. It was the kind of plan that requires trust. Joe trusted his wife completely. This was 1983. There was no cell phone to track, no text message trail, no security camera at every gas station along the interstate. If a young mother and her daughter drove south and didn't call right away, there was no digital breadcrumb trail to fall back on. Just a phone number and a name on a lease that didn't exist yet, and trust. That single fact is going to matter more than almost anything else in this story. In a different decade, this case might have ended in days. In 1983, it had room to swallow 42 years whole. There's no dramatic warning sign here. No fight the night before, no slammed door, no witness who says they knew something was wrong. That's part of what makes this story so unsettling. If you're expecting a villain lurking in a parking lot, a stranger in a van, the kind of nightmare scenario every parent is taught to fear, this isn't that. This is something quieter, and in some ways, something far more disorienting. Because the person who was about to make a 3-year-old girl disappear for 42 years wasn't a stranger at all. She was her mother. And on the morning of April 2nd, in 1983, nobody in that house had any idea that the next time most of them saw each other, if they ever did, 4 decades would have passed. An entire American century would have come and gone in miniature. And the little girl in the sailor dress would be a grown woman who didn't even know her own name. April 2nd, 1983, a Saturday. Debra packed a suitcase. She buckled 3-year-old Michelle into the back seat of their sedan. Kentucky plates. Nothing special about it. The kind of car that blends into every gas station parking lot in America. According to what Joe would later tell police, Debra kissed him goodbye and told him they'd call as soon as they were settled in. "We'll be waiting for you," she said. Michelle waved from her car seat. 3 years old, still in one of her favorite outfits. No idea. How could she? That this ordinary goodbye, the kind every kid gives a parent 100 times before they're old enough to remember any of them, was about to become the last normal moment of her childhood. Joe stayed behind. There was a lot to do. He had to give notice at his job. There was a house to sell, boxes to pack, a life to dismantle, one logistical task at a time. He expected a call that night, maybe the next morning. A quick check-in. "We made it. The place is small, but it'll do." The call never came. Here's something worth sitting with for a second, because it's easy to fly past it in a story this big. For the first day or two, nobody panics. That's not how this works. You don't get a call from your wife who's driving 12 hours with a toddler and immediately assume the worst. Maybe the new place didn't have a phone hooked up yet. Maybe she's exhausted and fell asleep before she could call. Maybe. Joe tried the number Debra had given him for the apartment complex in Georgia. Nothing. No answer. No working line at all, as it would later turn out. He called friends, relatives, anyone who might have heard from her, anyone who might have spotted that Kentucky-plated sedan somewhere along I-75. Nobody had seen anything. Days became a week became something heavier. And somewhere in that stretch of unanswered phone calls, Joe Newton crossed the line every parent dreads crossing. The moment worry stops being worry and becomes something closer to dread. The kind that sits in your chest at 2 a.m. The kind that doesn't go away when the sun comes up. He went to the police. And here's the part of this story that, decades later, still makes people angry on Michelle's behalf. At first, the Louisville police treated it as a marital dispute. A wife and kid taking some space. Maybe they'd cool off and come back in a week. In 1983, that wasn't an unreasonable first read. Parental separations leading to a few weeks of radio silence weren't rare. But weeks kept turning into months. And the tone in that precinct started to change. By late spring of 1983, what had started as, "Maybe she just needs space," became something else entirely. An open, formal missing persons investigation. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office issued bulletins. Debra Lee Newton, 24. Her daughter, Michelle Marie Newton, 3. A young mother and her toddler, last seen heading toward Georgia for what was supposed to be a fresh start. Flyers went up in truck stops, post offices, and churches across Kentucky, spreading down into Georgia along the same highway Debra had supposedly driven. The description on those flyers was almost painfully ordinary. That's what got under people's skin. There was no sensational detail to grab onto. Just a young family, doing what young families do, moving for a better life, and then simply ceasing to exist. Joe cooperated with every request investigators made. He handed over every detail he could remember. The planned route, the name of the apartment complex Debra had mentioned, every phone number he had. He didn't stop there. He drove to Georgia himself, knocked on doors in the area Debra had named, showed strangers a photograph of his wife and daughter, and asked the same question over and over, to faces that had no idea what he was talking about. Nothing. And then, sometime between late 1984 and early 1985, roughly a year and a half after she vanished, Debra called him. It wasn't the call he'd been waiting for. There was no address, no explanation. According to later police summaries, the conversation was brief and tense, just a handful of words before the line went dead. After that call, there was nothing. Not one more word. Not one sighting that ever checked out. The trail that Joe Newton had been chasing for a year and a half didn't just go cold. It evaporated entirely, like it had never existed in the first place. In the summer of 1985, a Jefferson County grand jury indicted Debra on a charge of custodial interference, a felony in Kentucky and one with no statute of limitations when a child is taken out of state. The FBI got involved, issuing a federal warrant for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. For a stretch in the mid to late 1980s, Debra's face appeared on the FBI's list of its top 8 most wanted parental kidnapping fugitives. A strange, narrow category of most wanted, but a real one, and one that put her photograph in federal buildings and post offices across the country. It even landed a segment on America's Most Wanted. You'd think that kind of national exposure would crack a case wide open. Sometimes it does. This time it didn't. Tips poured in for years. A woman who looked like Debra, spotted in Atlanta. Another in Florida. A little girl at a county fair in Alabama who matched Michelle's age-progressed sketch. Every single one came back negative. Each false lead cost something. Time. Money. And for Joe, he hoped, spent and respent again and again on a look-alike at a diner counter or a stranger's daughter at a fairground who turned out to be exactly that. A stranger's daughter. He kept driving to these places himself, sitting outside addresses in his car, watching women walk past grocery stores, hoping one of them would turn around and be the face he last saw kissing him goodbye in his own driveway. Quick gut check before we keep going, because I want you sitting with this the way Joe had to sit with it for years, not minutes. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city below. I want to see how far this story actually reaches tonight. And while you're typing that out, what's the weather like where you are? Because somewhere out there, on a night exactly like whatever's happening outside your window right now, so Joe Newton was sitting alone in a house with a little girl's bedroom he refused to touch. Let's keep going, because the next 10 years are, honestly, the hardest part of this story to watch unfold. By the early 1990s, the tips had slowed from a flood to a trickle. The case slid out of headlines the way most cases eventually do. Not because it was solved, but because the world simply had newer tragedies to cover. The FBI quietly removed Debra from its top 8 list. Other, more violent cases needed that spotlight more. Joe didn't get that luxury. There's no moving on button for a parent in his position. He never remarried. He kept Michelle's room exactly the way she'd left it. Stuffed animals lined up on the dresser, a small pair of pink sneakers still sitting by the door, like she might walk back in any afternoon and need them. In a rare 1986 television interview, his voice cracked as he looked directly into the camera and said something that, watched back decades later, still lands like a punch. Wouldn't you want your child back? At least to know she's safe? That's not a rhetorical question when you're the one asking it. That's a man negotiating with an empty room. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children produced age progression sketches over the years. Michelle at 8, Michelle as a teenager, an imagined face built from her mother's eyes and her father's smile, aging a little girl who, in reality, had no idea anyone was still drawing her. And then came the procedural blow that, frankly, should make you a little angry. In the year 2000, 17 years after Michelle vanished, the Jefferson County Commonwealth's Attorney's Office dismissed the original 1985 indictment. Not because new evidence cleared Debra, not because anyone decided this wasn't a crime after all. The stated reason was almost bureaucratically cruel in its simplicity. Prosecutors couldn't locate Joe Newton to testify. Read that again. The father who never stopped searching, who drove to strangers' towns and sat in parked cars outside addresses for years, lost his case not because the system failed to believe him, but because the system failed to find him. He'd moved a couple of times over the years, new job, new apartment, and hadn't kept paperwork updated with a court that, as far as he knew, was still actively working his daughter's case. The charge could technically be refiled at any point, since Kentucky's law carries no statute of limitations here. But technically refilable and actually being pursued are two very different things. For years, this case existed in the second category, open on paper, essentially abandoned in practice. 5 years after that, in 2005, Michelle's listing was pulled from the National Missing Children database, recalled according to records over a question of inaccurate information attached to the file. To anyone who didn't know the backstory, that might sound like a minor administrative footnote. To Joe, it felt like erasure. He found out only when he called to check on the status of the age progression photo, and a representative gently explained that his daughter's case was no longer active in the system that the entire country uses to keep missing kids visible. She was 19, 20 years old by then, old enough that, statistically, most agencies start to assume a missing child has either resurfaced safely under a new identity or isn't coming back at all. Nobody ever says that second possibility out loud to a grieving father. They don't have to. The silence says it for them. Joe kept believing anyway. For a decade more, with almost nothing to point to but stubbornness and love, he kept believing his daughter was out there. Think about what that actually requires. Not a single piece of new evidence for 10 straight years. Not one credible sighting. Just a man getting up every morning in a house that still had a little girl's bedroom in it, choosing, again and again, not to let that room become a guest room or a storage closet or anything else a rational person might eventually convert it into. That's not hope in the soft greeting card sense of the word. That's hope as a discipline. A daily decision repeated for thousands of days in a row with absolutely nothing externally reinforcing it. Okay, I need you to stay with me for this next part because this is genuinely the moment everything starts to turn, and I don't want you to miss it by clicking away right before the payoff. If you've made it this far into a case that took the legal system itself 17 years to even properly track its own witness, you already know this isn't a story that wraps up in a tidy hour. So do two things right now. First, subscribe, because the next case I'm covering picks up exactly where the nobody believed her theme leaves off, and you're going to want to see it. Second, if you've got a theory forming about how a woman stays hidden for over 40 years in plain sight in the United States, drop it in the comments before I tell you what actually happened. I want to see how close this community gets, because what reopens this case in 2015 isn't a body, a confession, or a forensic breakthrough. It's a single sentence a relative half-remembered from years earlier. In late 2015, a distant relative of Debra's reached out to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. She'd seen a news segment about an unrelated parental abduction case, a different family entirely, and something about it triggered an old memory. Years before Michelle and Debra ever vanished, Debra had once said, almost in passing, that if she ever needed to disappear, she'd go somewhere warm, somewhere quiet, somewhere with palm trees. That's it. That's the entire tip. Not an address, not a name, not a sighting, just a half-remembered sentence about palm trees passed along 32 years after it was originally spoken. It's almost nothing, and it was enough. A detective with the sheriff's office pulled the case file back out of storage. He re-interviewed Joe, now in his late 60s, older, grayer, but telling the exact same story he'd told in 1983, because it had never changed, because there was nothing left to embellish or forget. After confirming Joe was reachable this time, the lesson of 2000 clearly not forgotten, prosecutors reissued the warrant. In 2016, the case was formally back open. What followed wasn't a dramatic break. It was something slower and, in its own way, more interesting. A cold case running headfirst into a decade of new technology nobody had access to in 1983, or even in 2000. Genetic genealogy was exploding into public use. Millions of ordinary Americans were spitting into tubes and mailing them off to find out where their great-grandparents came from, and, increasingly, finding long-lost relatives they never knew existed. Law enforcement noticed. In 2018, a serial offender known as the Golden State Killer was identified after decades at large, traced through a distant relative's DNA sample uploaded to a public genealogy database. That case proves something investigators had only theorized before. You don't need the missing person's DNA directly. You need a relative's. Debra had a sister still living in the Louisville area. If investigators ever got a credible lead on someone claiming to be a different person entirely, that sister's DNA could become the key that confirmed it. For years, that was a plan with no application, a lock with no door to put it on. Then, in the spring of 2025, nearly a decade after the case reopened, 42 years after Michelle waved goodbye from a car seat, the Crime Stoppers tip line in Marion County, Florida, rang. Hold on 1 second before we get into that call, because I want you to do something with me. Whatever time it is right now, wherever you're sitting, hold that number in your head. Got it? Okay. At that exact same hour, decades earlier, somewhere in Florida, a woman who used to be Debra Newton was almost certainly going about an ordinary errand, completely unaware that a stranger 2 streets over had just noticed something about her face that nobody else ever had. That's the whole story in miniature. Decades of nothing, then one ordinary hour that changes everything. Here's how it happened. Real quick, because I genuinely want to know this. If you were Joe Newton 40 years into this, no body, no proof, nothing but a feeling that wouldn't quit, would you have kept looking? Or is there a point where most people would have let go just to survive the not knowing? There's no wrong answer here. I'm not asking to judge anybody. I'm asking because I think most of us like to believe we'd be Joe in that situation, and I'm not sure that's true for everyone. And I think that's worth sitting with honestly, instead of performing the answer we think sounds best. Drop your real answer in the comments. I read all of them, and on a story like this one, I think the honest answers matter more than the easy ones. Okay, Florida, 2025. This is where the 42 years finally end. According to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, an anonymous tip came in through Crime Stoppers in Marion County, Florida. A caller who'd been reading about old missing persons cases online. She'd come across Michelle's case. She'd seen the age-progressed image investigators had circulated for years, and she'd looked at a woman in her own community, quiet, kept to herself, lived alone in a retirement neighborhood called The Villages, and thought the resemblance was impossible to ignore. She didn't know if it meant anything. She gave the name the woman was going by, a rough location, and hung up. That's a thin tip on paper. Detectives get tips like that constantly, and the overwhelming majority of them go nowhere. But this one had a quality the hundreds of false leads over the previous 4 decades hadn't. It pointed to something specific and checkable. A real name, a real neighborhood, a real photo to compare. A detective with the U.S. Marshals Task Force pulled a recent photo of the woman, now going by a different identity in Marion County, and laid it next to the 1983 image of Debra Newton that had sat in case files for 42 years, kept a small dog, showed up at community events, the kind of person you'd never look at twice, but a birth date on file lined up close enough to Debra's real age to keep the lead alive. And in cold cases like this, close enough to keep alive is sometimes all you get before the real proof shows up. The real proof was DNA. Investigators went back to Debra's sister, the same relative still living in Louisville, the one who had quietly held onto a connection to this case for 42 years. She agreed to provide a reference sample. According to the sheriff's office, the comparison between her DNA and a sample collected from the woman in Florida came back as a 99.99% match. There is no ambiguity in a number like that. The quiet woman in the Florida retirement community, living under a name nobody in her neighborhood had ever questioned, was Debra Newton. And if Debra was really there, living a few hours from Orlando under a different identity for over 4 decades, there was an obvious next question hanging over every detective on this case. Where was Michelle? The answer, when it came, was almost unbearably ordinary. A woman living in a different part of Florida, going by a name she'd had since she was a kid, working as a veterinary technician, volunteering at an animal shelter on weekends. No criminal record, no reason for anyone ever to look twice at her life. She had absolutely no idea any of this was happening. Confirming an identity through DNA and family records is one thing. Building a legally sound case to actually make an arrest is another. Investigators spent the following weeks doing the quiet, procedural work that never makes it into a true crime documentary's highlight reel, but is exactly what makes an arrest like this stand up in court. They coordinated across 2 state lines: Kentucky, where the original 1985 indictment and 2016 reissued warrant lived, and Florida, where the suspect actually was. They built the documentation. They made sure that when deputies finally knocked on that door, every legal box had already been checked. And while all of that was happening behind the scenes, somewhere nearby, an unsuspecting woman in scrubs was finishing a regular shift at an animal clinic, completely unaware that her entire understanding of her own childhood was about to be rewritten in a single conversation. That's the part of this story that's almost harder to process than the original disappearance. Whatever Debra did or didn't tell her daughter over the decades, by every account, Michelle grew up loved. She had a mother who showed up, who by Michelle's own later description was simply my mom. Not a monster, not a kidnapper in the cartoonish sense most of us picture. Just the only parent she'd ever known. Which means somewhere underneath this entire story is a much harder question than how do you hide for 42 years. It's this. What do you do when the worst thing that ever happened to you was also done by the person who raised you with nothing but love? And there's a second question worth asking, one that doesn't get nearly as much attention as it should in stories like this. What does it actually cost a person to keep a secret like this for 42 years? Not legally, psychologically. Every new neighbor who asks where you're from. Every form that requires a maiden name, a birthplace, a medical history that has to skip your own daughter's earliest years like they never happened. Every 4th of July picnic, every community potluck, every small, ordinary moment of belonging somewhere, built on a foundation that could collapse with one wrong question from one curious stranger. Whatever judgment you're forming about Debra Newton right now, and you're allowed to form one, it's worth holding 2 truths at once. A serious crime, and 4 decades of a person never once getting to fully exhale. We're going to come back to that question, because Michelle herself had to answer it in real time with a stranger sitting across from her in her own living room. But first, the arrest. Monday, November 24th, 2025, the day before Thanksgiving. Cool, clear morning in the Villages. You already know how this scene starts. We open with it. A woman steps outside with a tote bag. Unmarked cars at the end of the street. A deputy who knows her real name before she said a single word. This time, we're going to stay in the scene a little longer. According to body camera footage released by the Marion County Sheriff's Office, the moment plays out with almost no drama at all, which is somehow more unsettling than if it had. She doesn't run. She doesn't argue. According to officials and footage from the scene, she stood there visibly in shock as deputies explained the warrant out of Jefferson County, Kentucky, a felony charge of custodial interference, the same charge that had been sitting open in one form or another since 1985. One officer's tone on the recording is almost gentle, almost apologetic for the weight of what he's there to do. Well, we're here for you, ma'am. Definitely here for you. She's placed in handcuffs, walked to the car, booked at the Marion County Jail, fingerprinted, photographed, processed exactly like anyone else facing a felony charge. No special treatment, no special cruelty either. Extradition paperwork moves fast. Because of the holiday, an initial court appearance gets arranged. A family member eventually travels to Kentucky to post her bond. And in the days that follow, Debra Newton appears voluntarily in Jefferson County Court to face a single felony charge. One that, because of how Kentucky law treats parental abduction across state lines, never had an expiration date, no matter how many years passed. It's worth pausing on something here because it's easy to let the dramatic arrest scene overshadow it. This case is still working through the courts. Debra has been charged. She has not been convicted of anything. Whatever you think you know about what happened in those 42 years, the legal system still has to do its job, methodically, the same way it would for anyone else. We'll get to where things stand as of right now toward the end of this video. But the arrest was never really the hardest part of this story to tell. The hardest part happened the same morning, a few dozen miles away in scrubs and a ponytail, in a small apartment with photos of rescue dogs on the walls. That's where someone had to tell a 46-year-old woman that her name wasn't really her name. Notifications like this one don't happen the way they do in movies. There's no dramatic reveal scene with swelling music. In real cases, agencies typically bring in someone trained specifically for this. A social worker or victim liaison experienced in delivering exactly this kind of news to adults who, legally and emotionally, are still considered victims of a crime that happened to them as toddlers, even decades later. According to the sheriff's office, it was Michelle herself who ultimately reached out and made contact after learning what was happening. She'd begun piecing together her own situation faster than anyone expected, and she called them. Try to sit in that for a second, because it's almost impossible to actually imagine. You're 46 years old. You've built an entire life, a job you're good at, a small apartment, a quiet routine, a story about your own childhood that you've told yourself and other people 1,000 times without ever once doubting it. And then, in the space of one conversation, you learn that the story was missing a piece nobody ever told you existed. Not a small piece. The foundational one. According to what Michelle later told a local news outlet, the moment officers explained the situation, they put it to her about as plainly as it can be put. You're not who you think you are. There's no version of hearing that sentence that doesn't rearrange something permanently inside you. She learned her real name, Michelle Marie Newton, born in Louisville, Kentucky, not wherever she'd always assumed. She learned she had been reported missing as a 3-year-old in 1983, that there were flyers with her face on them in truck stops across 2 states, decades before she was old enough to understand what a flyer even was. She learned that a man named Joseph Newton, a man she had never met, had spent 42 years keeping her bedroom exactly the way she'd left it as a toddler, refusing to let it become anything else. And she learned that the DNA results confirming all of it had come from her own aunt, a woman she'd presumably never met either, who had apparently been holding on to hope and possibly even a physical keepsake of her sister for over 4 decades, just in case a day like this ever came. According to the sheriff's office, once the news settled, Michelle didn't hesitate on the question that mattered most. Did her father know she was alive? He did. Could she meet him? That answer, too, was yes. If you've ever wondered what it would actually feel like to meet a parent for the first time at 46 years old, not as an infant, not as a kid, but as a fully formed adult who has to build an entirely new relationship from absolute zero, stick around. Because what happens next, according to the people closest to this case, is one of the most quietly emotional reunions you'll hear about this year. And if this video is doing what I hope it's doing for you, that subscribe button is right there. The reunion didn't happen in person first, it happened over the phone. 2 homes, hundreds of miles apart. Joseph Newton sitting in the same Louisville house he'd lived in for decades. The same house where Michelle's old bedroom still sat untouched. And Michelle, in her apartment near Ocala, holding a phone she'd been handed by someone trained to help guide exactly this kind of conversation. Try to imagine being on either end of that call. What do you even say first, after 42 years? It turns out, according to people familiar with the conversation, what they actually talked about wasn't the disappearance at all, at least not at first. They talked about small things, dogs, neighborhoods, the kind of low-stakes details strangers share to find solid footing before they're ready for the harder ground underneath. By the time the call ended, both of them were reportedly in tears. Neither one had expected that. 42 years of silence doesn't prepare you for how it actually feels when the silence finally breaks. Think about everything compressed into that single call. A father hearing a grown woman's voice for the first time, searching it instinctively for traces of the toddler he remembered. The same way you'd search an old song for the lyrics you used to know by heart. A daughter hearing the voice of a man who, biologically, made up half of who she is, and who she had never once heard speak before that exact moment. There's no script for that conversation. There's no etiquette guide. They just talked the way two strangers who happened to share everything and nothing in common might talk, and somehow that turned out to be enough to start. Thanksgiving Day arrived the next morning. For over 4 decades, Joe had cooked the same meal alone every single year in a house that never stopped feeling a little too quiet. This year, for the first time since 1983, he set more than one place at the table. Michelle flew in. According to the sheriff's office, both Michelle and Joseph were later seen together at her mother's arraignment in Jefferson County, standing side by side in a courtroom gallery. Father and daughter, present for each other, in a setting that nobody could have imagined just months earlier. Outside that courthouse, Michelle gave a brief statement to reporters that more than almost anything else in this entire story tells you who she actually is underneath all of this. She didn't frame herself as a victim looking for justice against her mother. She didn't frame herself as a daughter blindly defending the woman who raised her either. According to WLKY, her message was that she intended to support both her mother and her father through this process, and that she hoped eventually all of them could find a way to heal. That's not the ending true crime stories usually give you. There's no villain getting what they deserve in a satisfying final act. There's no clean reunion where everyone hugs and the credits roll. There's just 3 real people: a father who waited 42 years, a mother facing a felony charge for what she did to protect a decision she made at 24, and a daughter caught in the impossible middle of loving 2 people whose entire relationship to each other was built on one of them disappearing. So where does this case actually stand right now as we're putting this video together? Debra Newton has been charged with 1 count of custodial interference, a felony under Kentucky law. She has not been convicted. A family member posted her bond, and she voluntarily appeared in Jefferson County Court for arraignment, alongside the daughter and ex-husband she spent over 4 decades apart from. Her case continues to move through the legal system, and like any pending criminal matter, the only fair thing any of us can say right now is that the process hasn't finished playing out. Michelle Newton, still legally building the paperwork bridge between the name she grew up with and the name she was born with, has continued working as a veterinary technician in Florida and has been making regular trips to Louisville to spend time with her father. By every account that's emerged publicly, she's chosen not to weaponize this story against either parent. She's chosen instead something much harder: trying to hold both relationships at once, without pretending either one is simple. Joseph Newton, now in his mid-70s, finally has the one thing he spent 42 years asking for. In driveways and diners, and on grainy local news broadcasts, nobody but him probably remembers. Proof that his daughter is alive, and the chance, even now, even decades late, to actually know her. And somewhere in that same Louisville house, on the same mantle where it's apparently sat for over 4 decades, there's still a photograph of a 3-year-old girl in a sailor dress, smiling a gap-toothed smile at a camera in the spring of 1983. The only thing that's changed is what that smile means now. It used to be a question with no answer, a face on a flyer, a "have you seen her?" that nobody could answer for 42 years. Now it's just a photograph of someone's childhood. Sad in the ordinary way old photographs are sad, because time passed, because a little girl grew up somewhere her father couldn't watch, but no longer haunted by the unbearable possibility that she might never be found at all. There's a reason cases like this one stick with people longer than the headlines that announce them. It's not really about the 42 years, or the DNA match, or even the dramatic body camera footage of an arrest in a quiet retirement community the day before Thanksgiving. It's about what this story proves, in a way most of us would rather not have proven to us directly: that an entire life can hide inside an ordinary one, that the quiet neighbor with the small dog who waves at you while you're mowing your lawn might be carrying a 42-year secret you'd never guess in 100 lifetimes, and that the people left behind by a disappearance like this one don't get closure on anyone else's timeline. They get it whenever it comes, if it comes at all. Joe Newton waited 42 years for a phone call that finally said his daughter's name out loud and meant it. Most people never get that call. Most cold cases stay exactly that. Cold, then colder, then eventually just quiet, filed away in a cabinet that nobody opens anymore. This one didn't, because a relative remembered a half-forgotten sentence about palm trees, because a neighbor in a Florida retirement community looked twice at a familiar face, because a sister kept a strand of hair for 40 years just in case, and because, underneath all of it, one father simply refused to stop believing his daughter was still out there, somewhere, waiting to be found. She was. It just took 42 years to prove it. If this case got to you the way it got to me while I was putting it together, do 3 things before you go. Subscribe so the next cold case I cover lands in your feed the moment it's up. Drop a comment with one word that sums up how you're feeling right now. I genuinely read these. And on stories like this one, they matter more than the view count ever will. And if you know someone who'd sit through all 42 years of this with you, send them this video. Stories like Michelle's only stay solvable as long as enough people keep paying attention. I'll be back soon with another case the system almost let slip through the cracks. Until then, if there's a missing piece in your own family story, someone out there might still be looking for the answer. Thank you for watching the Crime Daily series.